When West Side Story was first performed in 1957, gang violence had only recently catapulted into the American consciousness. Things had been changing quickly for the post-war generation. People who could afford to were moving from the cities out to the suburbs. Many of these were people who had immigrated to the U.S. from Europe only one generation prior. But they left a vacuum behind them, particularly for low-wage employment, one that was filled with new groups of migrants increasingly from Latin America, or in the case of New York City, from the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico. In 1953, some 75,000 Puerto Ricans were arriving each year in the city as part of what's commonly called the Great Migration, up from only 1,800 in the late 1930s. Many of these people didn't expect to face the discrimination they felt upon arrival, fueling their alienation and discontent. At the same time, the rifts in the social fabric caused by these dramatic changes contributed to a growing disaffection among the young people living in U.S. cities. In 1954, the U.S. Senate had convened the Subcommittee on Youth Delinquency. Newspapers were increasingly documenting violence in cities, often related to gang involvement. In 1958, the New York Times published a 7-part series on the shook-up generation, illuminating the many gangs of New York City and the violence that was a regular part of their lives. The gangs had names like the Latin Aces, the Imperial Knights, or the Stone Killers. Many of the members came from poor neighborhoods, lived in housing projects, and grew up without fathers or a safety net. The report is replete with stories of turf wars, police encounters, violent episodes, and far too many deaths. This was the backdrop against which West Side Story was created and produced.
West Side Story kind of forces you to really engage with issues, like gang violence and police relations with the community, and just this whole dynamic of being poor, and also the dynamic of being a foreigner and trying to come to this country, live in this environment where it's like you're constantly at odds with it. You look at West Side Story, you're so engrossed in it because two people are in love and you want them to succeed, but you have to face these issues that are causing them not to succeed, and that's what hits you. It's not the fact that just these issues exist, it's that these issues are preventing love. I think the biggest impact of West Side Story really is the fact that it wasn't afraid to bring these issues into a form of entertainment that's supposed to be leisurely.
One of the central accomplishments of West Side Story is that the audience is able to identify with every character, even when they're doing bad things. The Jets, children of Polish or Irish immigrants, are looking for a sense of belonging and control in a fast-changing world. The Sharks are looking to make a place for themselves in a new country. When combined with poverty, adolescence, and discrimination, these sentiments can become explosive and deadly, despite many of the characters' often conflicted intentions.
You take basically the classic Romeo and Juliet story, and you know that's a tragic story. You know it's a doom story. But when you think about Shakespeare's version, it's not in the context that we can really relate to living in modern society or the 20th century. But when you take that and you put it to these street gangs and to these people who are in these cycles of violence because they're in conditions that they don't have a lot of resources. And so all they see is, I have to survive, right? I have to make it out of here. I have to take care of those around me. And you really look at the gangs and you look at, in West Side Story, how they're organized. They're not family. They're just people who are all coming from the same walks of life and all feel the same sense of hopelessness. So to them, this is how I survive. This is how I find, some type of something solid and grounding in the world. The way that it ends, you're always reminded that, wow, love can't survive in a world where there's no love.
While West Side Story was a clear product of its times, the many themes it raises are still with us. In the past year, issues of discrimination and violence have dominated the news. The U.S. now has the most incarcerated population in the world, and many of those incarcerated are from minority populations who often receive longer sentences than their white counterparts for the same crimes. While the country has seen an overall decline in violence in the past 25 years, we are still far too familiar with gang violence, especially in our cities. West Side Story asks people to look more deeply at the causes of this violence and intolerance and reflect on the humanity behind the issues. And ultimately, it calls on us to question how we can move past these issues to a better world.
How do you break out of the cycle of violence? I think that's a very multi-layered question, and I think West Side Story only scratches the surface of really offering an answer, because it doesn't really offer an answer more so than it just presents the situation kind of in a really eye-opening way, like, hey, look at this situation. I think it's funny, like, listening to Officer Krupke, man, the lyrics are so skillfully crafted with how they're actually describing their social situation, and they're saying their mothers are junkies and just all these things. We're saying like we're socially inept and all these things, and you're like, they're laughing about it, but these are really real. And it's really sad. It's really heartbreaking what they're saying, but there is hope that we can grow beyond it, and I think that's kind of the most important thing that art does, is gives us it gives us the reality, but also gives us a little push to say, wait, there's hope. It doesn't have to be like this.